Hi, and welcome back to Science Nutshell. We're now going to talk to Dr. Dave Goulson, acclaimed author of A Sting in the Tail, about his upcoming book and his other recent publications. So, Dr. Goulson, could you just tell us a bit about A Sting in the Tail?
Yeah, sure. Sting in the Tail is kind of a book about bumblebees, which I've spent the last 20 years or so studying as a scientist. It's a little bit also about the fun of doing science and trying to kind of demystify what science is all about. But mainly it is a book about bees. So let me just tell you a little bit about bees and why I would have bothered to spend 20 years studying them. They've been around for about 120 million years, but during the age of dinosaurs, long before there were people. And about 80% of all the terrestrial plants on Earth depend upon insect pollinators, mainly on bees, to pollinate them. Without them, they wouldn't set any seed. We wouldn't have flowers, basically. And obviously, there's a direct link to our own well-being there, in that many of our crops depend upon bee pollination. So about 3/4 of all the food that of all the food types that we grow in the world depend upon bees and other insects to pollinate them. So if we were to lose our bees, then we'd lose most of the nice food we like to eat, like fruits and veg and so on. In fact, we'd be left pretty much eating bread and porridge and rice, which would be pretty dull. So we need to look after them, and a little bit of the book is kind of serious about the declines of bees. But one of the nice things about bees is it's not like polar bears or tigers or pandas or whatever that you kind of you hear on the news that they're disappearing, and you think, well, what can I do about it? Not a lot usually. But with bees, everyone can help. You know, they live all around us. They live in our back gardens, our parks, and whatever. And it's really easy to do simple things to help them. I mean, the simplest and most obvious is to grow bee-friendly flowers. I started a charity, the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, which has a website. I'll give you loads of ideas about how you can help to look after bees. But it's something everyone can get involved in, which I think is really nice. And it's really important that we do, because we need to look after these little things. And maybe bees are then a step into persuading people to more broadly appreciate the importance of biodiversity and looking after the planet, I guess.
That's brilliant. Yeah, because you're saying also in this Nature paper you've done on bumblebees and pesticides and things and birds that have been affected. Would you say sort of buying organic food can help the bees, or is that more to do with the birds?
Yeah, it's a long and slightly complicated story, but we do use a lot of pesticides. I mean, we've been doing studies of the effects of pesticides on bees in particular, and an average field in the UK gets about 20 different types of pesticide applied to it every year. So just in one crop growing season. So there's different insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, molluscicides, and so on. Now, if you think about it, I mean, if I've got a garden behind me where I grow my veg, I wouldn't dream of putting 20 different pesticides onto my carrots or my peas or whatever, and then feeding them to my family. But when you go to the supermarket, that's exactly what you're doing. I don't think people realise quite how many chemicals go onto our food. So we do buy and grow organic food. And I would suggest that people might think about it. But from a bees and a bird's perspective, there's a particular group of pesticides that are very controversial called neonicotinoids, which are kind of synthetic versions of nicotine. And they have a number of problems, but the key ones are they're really persistent in the environment, and they're systemic, so plants, they get into all the parts of it, and anything that eats it, including the pollen or the nectar if you're a bee, contains these poisons. And there's pretty good evidence that they're having an adverse effect on our wild bees, and more broadly on insect populations. They're very toxic to insects. They're insecticides, so you'd expect that. But because they persist and they get into the soil and they accumulate and they get into streams and hedgerow plants and so on, that any insect life living in farmland seems to be being affected. And the new evidence, the bird paper that was in Nature, which I should say the primary data paper wasn't mine. That was from a Dutch group that I was asked to write an opinion piece on it in Nature. Really interesting piece of work, but it basically suggests that areas of the Netherlands where they have higher levels of these pesticides, insectivorous bird populations are declining more rapidly, and the obvious explanation is that simply it's knocking out their food supply. It shouldn't really be a great shock to anyone that insecticides kill insects, but if it's knocking out all the insects, then that has real repercussions for not just for bees, but generally for the sustainability of the whole system. You know, we need bees, we need insects that live in soil to keep the soil healthy, we need natural enemies of crop pests and so on. And if we're just knocking out the whole lot, then that's pretty shocking. And we really need to change what we're doing, in my view.
And you're saying about how the insecticides and the pesticides get into pollen and things. Now, I don't really know much about the ethics of beekeeping, but does this mean the honey is also getting high levels of insecticides and pesticides?
Yeah, so if you analyse honey samples or the pollen stores in honeybee hives, they collect their food from huge areas. You know, they'll fly 2 or 3 miles to find food, so they're bringing back pesticides from the landscape. And in fact, there's an interesting question there as to whether it's possible to organic honey, buy organic honey, but I don't think that there's anywhere in Britain where you could produce organic honey realistically, because the bees don't restrict it. Even if you put the hives on an organic farm, they'll fly over the hedge and visit the neighbouring farms, unfortunately. So yeah, if you analyse the honey from bee colonies, you find actually dozens of pesticides in them. They're usually at fairly low concentrations, but there's a whole cocktail of things in there, not just these neonicotinoids I mentioned, but a whole bunch of other things, fungicides and herbicides and other insecticides and so on. The effects of which on the bees we don't really know, but of course we also consume them, which is perhaps of more direct concern.
Okay, thank you. I was also wondering about your new book, A Buzz in the Meadow. Could you just sort of give us a little blurb to what it's about, and is it a bit more of a hopeful story than the bees?
Yeah, well, so A Buzz in the Meadow is basically a book about 11 years ago I bought an old farm, mainly to get hold of the land so that I could basically make a nature reserve for bees and other wildlife. And also do experiments there on how best. So the basic idea was they've got 33 acres of what was a wheat field when I got it 11 years ago, and I've been slowly trying to recreate a flower meadow, one of the sort of beautiful flower-rich habitats that we used to have lots of in Europe, and one of the key places where bees and other insects thrive. And it's the story of basically trying to convert this very boring arable field into a beautiful habitat full of wildlife. It's not complete yet, but it's well on the way, and it's a really cool place. I go down every year, and I've got these long-running experiments trying out different ways of different seed mixtures to try and speed up the process. And I'm trying. You can use, they're called hemiparasitic plants like yellow rattle, which help to suppress the grasses and encourage other wildflowers to move in and so on. And it's actually the real reason I do it. I mean, the science is a bonus, but actually it's just a great place to go and potter about and chase after insects. And there's a lot of other stuff there as well. The house is actually full of dormice, and there's 2 owls that live in the loft, and various other creatures that make a mess but are cute to have around.
I'm glad you said about the other creatures, because I'm a big fan of meadow voles, and it always upsets me how much they're in decline and then the effect that has on owls. So yeah, that sounds really good. Thank you very much.
Sorry, go on.
Carry on. No, carry on.
I was just going to say, if I brought you back some of the owl pellets from my loft, you'd find that those owls get through an awful lot of voles.
That's quite good. That's brilliant. Okay, so we're going to put a link to the book. It's available from Amazon and lots of good bookstores. We're also going to put a link to the charity you mentioned, so all the people that watch can also look at what plants to grow. Thank you very much again. Thank you. Bye.